Next up, we'll have Mary Binko with senior author Natalie Sridharan from Pittsburgh presenting on industry funding negatively impacts publication of vascular surgery trials.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to present our work. Anywhere from 30 to 50% of completed randomized clinical trials across disciplines are reported as unpublished in the literature. This problem is not only common, but significant as it results in a loss of knowledge and publication bias, which raises ethical concerns for participating patients. However, the extent of publication bias within vascular surgery remains unknown. Our first aim was to understand the magnitude of publication bias by calculating the frequency of both discontinued and unpublished clinical trials in vascular surgery. Second, to identify factors associated with these trials. And third, to evaluate the timely publication of trials in peer-reviewed journals. We included randomized comparative clinical trials related to vascular surgery registered on clinicaltrials.gov over nearly a 10-year period. Trials were classified as completed if they met enrollment sample size and discontinued if they failed to do so. Discontinued trials were further subclassified as withdrawn if they stopped enrolling prior to their first patient, and terminated if they stopped enrolling patients early. Completed trials were classified as published if they were identified in a peer-reviewed journal, automatically indexed on clinicaltrials.gov, PubMed, or Google Scholar, allowing for at least 30 months from trial completion to publication. More specifically, we included phase 3 and 4 randomized comparative clinical trials enrolling adults that were related to vascular using the keyword search. This search criteria yielded 270 clinical trials, of which 35 were duplicates and excluded. Another 84 were excluded for not meeting the criteria outlined, leaving us with 151 clinical trials that underwent a 2-physician review of study title and description to ensure that they fell within the field of vascular surgery, of which 43 failed to do so and were excluded, leaving us with a total of 108 clinical trials in our analysis. The clinical trials most commonly investigated PAD at approximately 40%, followed by VTE at 20%, and about half of these trials were surgical and half non-surgical. So of the total 108 clinical trials, 78% were completed, meeting enrollment sample size, compared to the 22% that were discontinued, and that encompassed a total of 3,303 patients. More specifically, 17% were withdrawn prior to enrolling their first patient, compared to 83% that were terminated, stopping enrollment early. Approximately 80% of trial investigators provided a reason for discontinuation on clinicaltrials.gov, where poor enrollment was the most common reason for discontinuation, cited by 46% of trial investigators, and only 26% of estimated enrollment was achieved among these discontinued trials, highlighting issues with enrollment. Other common reasons for discontinuation include inadequate supplies and funding, as well as study design concerns. So next I'd like to switch gears and focus on the publication status of completed trials. So to recap, of that total 108 trials, 78% were completed, meeting enrollment sample size. 76 were published in a peer-reviewed journal, compared to 24% that remain unpublished. Only 40% of these unpublished trials had results reported on clinicaltrials.gov, compared to the 60% that failed to do so. And then only a small minority of these had abstracts available in conference proceedings. So we wanted to look at factors that influence publication in peer-reviewed journals, and we found that industry funding significantly decreases the likelihood of publication in a peer-reviewed journal, where 65% of unpublished trials report industry as a source of funding, compared to only 27% of published trials. So I wanted to take a step back and talk about the funding of all completed clinical trials. The non-industry funding is largely comprised of other sources of funding from either individuals, universities, or community-based organizations. And then only 2% of the trials in our study had additional funding from the NIH or US federal government. Industry funding was comprised mostly of industry alone at 25% and 11% by industry and other. When we look at a subgroup analysis, again, we see that both industry alone and industry plus other sources of funding are both associated with a decreased likelihood of publication. So we really wanted to investigate this relationship between industry funding and decreased publication. And so we went back to clinicaltrials.gov and we found some limited information on the contracts that exist between the sponsor and investigator that outline the investigator's ability to publish trial results. So of the completed clinical trials, 19% had reported contracts on clinicaltrials.gov. 43% of the industry-funded trials reported contracts compared to 6% of non-industry-funded trials. And I think that really highlights the transparency among these industry-funded trials. When we look at the degree of restriction, we see that of the industry-funded trials, 10% of the contracts reported no restrictions on publication, 10% minimal restriction, and 23% major restriction that would really limit the investigator's ability to discuss or publish trial results. And so we wanted to look at this relationship between the degree of restriction in these contracts and publication status. And we found that the contracts that significantly restrict the investigator's right to publish trial results were more common among these unpublished clinical trials compared to the published ones. When we look at the timeliness of peer-reviewed publication, we see that the median time to publication is 1.9 years, and that most published trials are reporting either positive or neutral results, with only 5% reporting negative results. The average journal impact factor of published clinical trials is 10.3, where a higher impact factor is associated with a faster time to publication. There are several limitations to our study. Clinicaltrials.gov is the only registry used, and it relies on information updated by the trial investigators. Some of these trials may be misclassified as unpublished, although we tried to minimize that risk by using multiple search terms in 2 different databases, PubMed and Google Scholar. And a minimum follow-up period of 30 months from trial completion to publication may have resulted in a lower publication rate. So in conclusion, nearly 1 in 4 clinical trials in vascular surgery were discontinued, most commonly due to poor enrollment. Of the 78% of completed trials, 24% remain unpublished in vascular surgery, which falls within the range reported in other disciplines. We also found that industry funding is significantly associated with a decreased likelihood of publication, and that the median time to peer-reviewed publication is 1.9 years, which successfully falls within the 2-year expectation of the World Health Organization. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks. That was a really interesting presentation. Was there any theme in the ones that weren't published and that were under contract? Were there any themes within the industries, like certain types of products or certain types of companies? Were you able to tease that out?
So one of the factors that we did look at between published and unpublished trials was the type of intervention, so whether that was a drug, device, or biologic. We found on multivariate logistic regression that the biologics did have a slightly higher rate among the unpublished clinical trials.
I want to ask a little bit more about the unpublished studies that you were just discussing. One, I wonder if you can look at some of those unpublished studies and find other kind of retrospective reviews or things that might have shifted the equipoise within the literature about those. I don't know if you had the ability to kind of look at that.
That's a really interesting question. At this point, we haven't gone back into the literature to look at whether it sort of shifted over the 10-year period, but it would be really interesting. I know the FDA Amendment Act came out in 2007 requiring publication of the trial results, so we tried to look after that period starting in 2010, but certainly that would be really interesting to look at.
And the other thing that I was really shocked by was the nature of the low enrollment. And that's a very frustrating thing, I think, whenever we are in these academic settings and talking about science and we want to promote it. And then when you get to the real world situations, the VESS CLL trial is a great example of that. And there are many other trials where enrollment is very low because people believe in their head there is something that we're going to offer first. And I think that's something that should all make us pause and step back and try to help with this. So thank you.
Okay, great talk.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you so much.